I've been offline lately, and it's freed me up to invest in my real-life relationships, get some work done, pursue my interests, read some Wikipedia. And while I was going down one of those Wikipedia rabbit holes, I saw a name I hadn't seen in a very long time. Vampire the Masquerade. And I got excited. I was like, oh, what's my old friend Vampire doing? So I clicked the link and there's a new edition out. It's been out for a few years. Wow! I hate new things! But White Wolf did a very smart thing. Around the time they released this new 5th edition, they also released a live roleplay show demonstrating how the new system worked. But then something weird started to happen. I started having ideas for characters I wanted to play for Chronicles. Do I want to play vampire? Is that what's happening in my life right now? So how about we explore that a little bit, kick the tires on the new system, do a deep dive on LA by night, and see how we feel. I'm gonna start by talking about the system because nothing I say is gonna make any sense if you don't know what the fuck a smeezy is. Not that anyone knows what a smeezy is. So, let's get into it. Vampire is a horror role-playing game set in the World of Darkness. The World of Darkness is shared between multiple role-playing games, with Werewolf and Vampire being White Wolf, the publisher's most popular. This setting is a world gone to shit, violent, grungy, quick to dispose of the innocent. The end of the world really is nigh. I think if I told you there was a game from the mid-90s about vampires, you'd probably assume they were like Anne Rice vampires. And don't get me wrong, you can play those, shout out to Clan Toreador, but honestly, the setting lends itself best to organized crime stories. Think The Sopranos, or Breaking Bad, or Better Call Saul. Like, all of those would make great inspirations for vampire campaigns. Or chronicles, they call them chronicles. There are 13 clans of vampires, each one a different archetype of vampirism, and each one has their own powers and weaknesses. The Ventrue are ambitious and aspire to rule. Gangrel are animalistic loners. The Toreador are beauty-obsessed and of course prefer to embrace hot artists, which, you know, same. Bruja are rebels. Nosferatu are secretive and disfigured. Tzimisce are extreme body modders, hopefully their own body, but you never know. You get the idea. When somebody is made into a vampire, which they call being embraced, they're always of the same clan as their sire, their vampire daddy. And of course, as a vampire, you have superpowers, which are called disciplines, and what you can learn depends on what clan you're from. But as they become older and more powerful, they become less and less human until their needs are inscrutable, and eventually they become nothing but hunger. They are damned. So a little bad news. Vampires generally do not like one another, but they can come together for specific purposes in a group called a coterie. These tend to fall apart once that purpose has been filled, though. More human vampires can make friends, they can even fall in love, but the arc of those relationships is inevitably toward tragedy. The rundown I just gave you is generally true of all editions from the original one to the current. I personally have played a fair amount of the original Vampire and a little bit of Requiem, and yeah, I live action roleplayed. Yeah, I walked around house parties, ate pizza, drank Coke from a wine glass, and pretended to be the knight. Like, yes, I LARPed a Ventrue, and I know that that is incredibly cringy. Because I'm a fucking Bruja, like, duh! Hello. These girls have not seen the light of day since 2012. That's not when I was embraced, that was when I became less of a hoe. Playing a vampire and how people perceive that got a serious test run back in 2014 or so when a congressional candidate, Jake Rush, got outed by his primary opponent as being a vampire LARPer. And he, like me, also LARPed a Ventrue, Lord Stas van der Winst. He did not win his primary, I think in part because there were pictures of him in costume.
Welcome, my king. Thank you for joining me here so close to midnight. The witching hour.
I don't think much has changed since 2014. Like, yeah, it's cool to be nerdy, But there's nerdy and then there's nerdy, and vampire still fits firmly in the latter category, I think. I think it's fair to say that from a marketing standpoint, vampire could have done with a reboot. And I think that's what they tried to do with this new version, V5. Make it more friendly for new players, both by making the gameplay more accessible, but second, you make some changes to the flavor text and gameplay and how you interact with the community to make it clear that diverse people are welcome at the gaming table. So let's take a look at the new rulebook, and just as a disclaimer, I haven't played with this yet. I have read the rulebook and I've watched it played. But this is me evaluating whether I want to play it, not a review of how the game actually plays. So first big change to the system, you get hungrier. Every time you use a discipline, you roll a die to see if you get hungrier. The hungrier you are, the more likely you are to spectacularly fail, and there are steeper penalties for that kind of failure. Failures can make you gain a compulsion for the duration of the scene. Like, think in vampire lore where you could get away from a hungry vampire by just throwing rice on the ground, and now the vampire has to stop and count all of them before he can continue trying to eat you. That's sort of what a compulsion is. The way it works out in gameplay is like, if your Toreador is enchanted by the beauty of the silver dagger that her assailant is trying to use to stab her with, that is not helpful. And a compulsion is the mild penalty. The worst thing that could happen is frenzy, where you lose complete control of the character to the storyteller until that character can fight, flee, or eat their way out of the emergency that caused the frenzy. You can also do too well and get what's called a messy critical, where you succeed, but only because the beast took you over.
The darkest part of my mind is reserved for the beast.
It's basically getting everything you wanted from this little micro interaction, maybe more than you wanted, at the cost of all the penalties of a critical failure. The beast is what's left when you lose your humanity. More on that in a minute. So with all of these new and exciting ways to fail, if you're not down for a system that is going to kick you squarely in the balls about every other session, this might not be the game for you. Having looked at Reddit, it is a sticking point how often you fail. Another change, in older versions of the game you had to maintain the masquerade, the pretense that you, vampires, do not exist to the human world. The logic behind that was that individual humans are weak, but humanity united against vampires would win every time. However, the way that used to play out was there would be a masquerade breach and then other vampires would get mad at you. For the most part, unless it was like a specific plot point in your game, humans were not a threat. In this version of the game, the masquerade has been breached. The US government knows you're there, even if citizens are kinda in the dark about it. Not only do they know you exist, they have been coming after more powerful vampires than you and winning. So you should not be breaching the masquerade because you will get fucking killed. This feels different because it's more of an existential threat to the entirety of your kind, and that's more compelling to me personally. Humanity is the stat that represents both your connection to human ethics and your connection to humanity itself, and it's way more central to the system this time around. You still have a maximum of 10 points of humanity, but to be real, only saints have a 10. You're probably at about a 7. Before, humanity was more like a ranking of sins, where if you committed a certain sin at a certain level of humanity, like if you were at a 6 humanity but you murdered somebody which was, I think, at a 3 humanity, you might drop a humanity because that sin is lower than your current level of humanity. It's confusing, and not only that, but say you've already murdered somebody and you drop down to a 3 humanity, I guess you get to murder however many people you want now? In V5, instead of a ranking of sins, you, at character creation, pick 3 personal convictions, 3 values you hold dear to your identity. And those can be just about anything as long as they're specific. Like, I will be a good person isn't good enough, but I defend the weak, that's a good conviction. In addition to personal convictions, there are story-level convictions, which affect characters whether they personally believe in them or not. If you violate one of your personal values or one of the values of the story and you don't show remorse or make amends, you can lose a point of humanity. Lower humanity has gameplay and roleplay consequences. You heal more slowly, it's harder for you to pass as human, and you start losing your interpersonal connection to the human world. The way that's enforced in gameplay is, at character creation, you create a touchstone for every personal value you have. A touchstone is a person that represents that value within the story. For instance, if one of your personal values is, I don't kill innocent people, one of your touchstones might be the daughter of an innocent person you accidentally killed before the start of the story. Now you feel compelled to take care of her because she doesn't have a mom. If you lose humanity because you violated one of your values, your relationship with that touchstone should change for the worse. Like, if you repeatedly violate that I don't kill innocent people personal value, that little girl in story should be going through a rough time. If one of those touchstones does get hurt or changed or even destroyed, it does significant damage to your humanity. And that makes a lot of sense. If somebody kills the little girl who represents innocence to you in your life, that's going to jade you. But you can't spend all of your time as a vampire being nice to little girls, so you have to maintain like this little dance, right, of trying to maintain this relationship while also keeping your distance to keep that thing safe. And if it sounds like this is a no-win situation, congrats, you have found the point of the game. And all of that is great to me. Like, there was a lot of lip service to this in old versions of Vampire, but this is in the mechanics now. This is a game about disempowerment, and that's horror. And that's great. I love horror. That said, the reception seems to be a little bit mixed. A lot of people play RPGs as an empowerment fantasy, and this isn't what this system is. There were also some critiques of the game, which I'm not really going to dig into here, in part because I don't really have the bandwidth or the time to do them justice, and because the publisher largely agreed with them and took steps to ameliorate the problems. But those missteps may have possibly dinged Vampire's reputation as a welcoming space for diverse role players. So it looks like, for whatever reason, V5 didn't give Vampire that D&D 5th edition break out into the mainstream moment. But that doesn't make it a bad game. In fact, from everything I've seen, it has the potential to be a really great one. We have come to the part of the video that I have been looking forward to, and that is MK gets to gush about LA by night. But I'm gonna change into something a little more appropriate first. I'm not sure I want there to be video of me on the internet with my bra out talking about what a big fan I am of B. Dave Walters. Not that there's anything wrong with B. Dave Walters. I love B. Dave Walters. It's just, it's weird now, isn't it? Oh, there we go. So, LA by Night. LA by Night is an actual play web series set in Los Angeles, California, after the events of the video game Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. We begin by following a coterie of 3 vampires. Victor is a hip-hop producer, the proprietor of a nightclub, and of course, a Ventru. Nelli, a good friend to Victor, or as close as vampires get to friends, and a fashion designer. Then we have Jasper, their spy and enforcer, and he's not particularly close to either Nelli or Victor. As Victor puts it, Jasper makes problems disappear and is often away doing that as hired work for other people. The 3 are a part of the Anarch movement. The Anarch movement is organized into independent baronies, and under the baron are smaller coteries of vampires who are given feeding rights in neighborhoods in exchange for keeping those neighborhoods safe, keeping an eye out to other supernatural creatures who are hostile to vampires, looking out for masquerade breaches, looking out for rival political factions, that kind of thing. Nelli, Jasper, and Victor have control over Griffith College, and the very first episode opens with them discussing a possible breach to the masquerade. Somebody's been poaching blood. Bags of blood are missing from the infirmary, and a bunch of students are showing up with flu-like symptoms. So after some digging, they come across Annabelle, a student and activist who was turned and then abandoned by her sire. So the coterie brings her to the Baron, says, what do we do with her? And he says, teach her how to be a vampire, teach her how to feed without breaking the masquerade, teach her how to survive. There is a war brewing with the Camarilla, a rival political faction, and they frankly need all the bodies they can get. But one of the things that Annabelle has to learn as a vampire is how to keep her distance from her friends and from her political ties, because that's dangerous to them. She made an offhand remark to the Baron that maybe one of her friends might have known she was a vampire, and that friend immediately turned up dead. So that's the general jumping off point for the plot of the game, and from there it becomes very, very character driven. So I think it makes the most sense for me to explore it by doing an analysis of each of the characters. But before I do that, maybe some general housekeeping notes and some discussion of like plot, tone, pacing, all that. I'm going to be taking LA by Night seriously as a piece of narrative media, which might set me up to be a little bit harsh because the point of comparison is scripted shows. Second, keep in mind that we critique because we love, not because we want to backseat RP, not because we want to say something sucks. We do it to sharpen our own aesthetic sensibilities and to explore things that we like. So let's get started. I think the most common entry point for watching actual plays of RPGs is Critical Role, which is a runaway success. I didn't come from there. I came from Dimension 20. And Dimension 20 is very, very tightly plotted. I think it's because Dimension 20 is more of an improv show that uses D&D as its game. And so they're very good at pacing, they're very good at keeping things moving. Critical Role has a different philosophy, which is you are eavesdropping on actual friends actually playing D&D. They're gonna take their time. Relax. LA by Night is way closer to the pacing of Critical Role than Dimension 20, so if you're looking for that fast type pacing, it's not there. Is it a flaw? You'll have to adjust your expectations, and it might be easier to watch for some people. It's certainly easier to watch for my husband if you watch it at maybe a sped up pace on YouTube. Sometimes we spend a little bit too long in a scene and we repeat information or emotional beats and the tension kind of bleeds out. This is just a hazard of the medium. I think the storyteller, Jason Carl, is very, very good. He is especially good at sort of the sensual details of the world. You can really feel the grime on the walls. You can feel the plush carpet under you. You can feel the pleasure of the kiss. It's very sensual and I'm into it. At least in this setting, Jason Carl is a very lenient DM. In most vampire games, mistakes really bite you in the ass, and he goes a little easier than I would expect. He's also pretty lenient with the rules in favor of the players and has homebrewed a few things. So if you're looking for a perfect example of how you would play a home game, maybe this isn't it, but it makes for good watching, so who cares? And honestly, if your own storyteller at home doesn't bend the rules once in a while just for fun's sake, what are they even doing? Again, this is a very character-driven show, and I like the characters a lot. Like Annabelle, fellow Bruja, fellow activist, my girl. Annabelle really shines when she has personal moments with people she has a deep history with. Her scenes with her sire, maybe the best actor-to-actor chemistry in the entire show. Like, holy shit. That said, Annabelle doesn't really want to be there. She would rather be back being an activist, being with her friends, and so she doesn't have a lot of agency in any given scene early on. Erika Ishii is given the kind of thankless task of being the newbie, being somebody who doesn't know what's going on and who doesn't necessarily have a lot of power over what's happening in the scene. And that is a hard row to hoe, like, truly. And I think she does it with a lot of grace and a lot of charm, and then the character eventually does get a little more power. Nelli G, our Toreador, is probably at her best when she's murdering somebody, which, thankfully for us, is frequently. Nelli G might be the most ruthless member of the cast, certainly the most callous, and she has a hidden agenda, which, unfortunately, she doesn't always share with the audience. I say unfortunately because we don't always know what her burning desire is to be in this place with these people at this moment. And that means she can recede into the background for me a little bit. It could come across kind of like Nelli G is just kind of there to hang out, which You know, what charming company. Like, it's not a big complaint. I think everybody who loves stories has particular characters and stories that they really love, that really grab them. And for whatever reason, Nelli G and Annabelle never quite had a moment where they grabbed me by the viscera. And I don't think it has anything to do with like talent. Like Erika Ishii and Cynthia Marie are obviously wildly talented. I think it's just a matter of what am I looking for from stories? Where do I come from? What really makes me tick? And that's obviously a me thing and not a them thing. Victor Temple now is my guy. Like, I'm a reformed Ventru, and it's because I find stories about ambition very compelling. You always know what Victor wants in a scene, what he's trying to accomplish, what his short and long-term goals are, and that is down to B. Dave Walters, who is very good at communicating those things. Victor is the owner of a record label and the proprietor of a popular club, and that is where most of the party's resources come from. We don't just hear that Victor is good at business, we get to see it. He is the one who procures weapons. He's the one who procures food. He is their logistical backbone. B. Dave Walters' instincts to ground the scene in what resources do I have and what am I trying to accomplish means that the plot of LA by Night tends to be structured around Victor. This is down to the scene level even. Like, a scene often begins and ends with Victor arranging transportation. That choice to be the one who takes care of the logistics of the group can kind of be a little bit thankless as a player. Like, you only really notice it as the audience if it goes badly, like if it doesn't sound like this guy knows what he's talking about. So I think it really speaks to him as a generous player that he took that role on. As if that isn't enough, Victor is this big personality. B. Dave Walters plays him as charismatic. So if B. Dave Walters ends up failing a charisma check, you don't go, look at this goofy asshole. You go, oh, this antagonist has hidden depths. That is a cool trick to pull off in roleplay. And now we come to Jasper. I'm gonna spend a minute on Jasper, and it's because I think he really demonstrates the kind of story you can tell with this system. Jasper is a Nosferatu, which is a clan of vampires who are disfigured by their embrace. Even the ones with relatively minor disfigurements do not pass as human. Their bloodline does have access to powers that can make themselves invisible, which is why the other clans don't gang up on them to take them out as a threat to the Masquerade. They're generally intelligent, secretive, a little more loyal than other clans, and melancholy. Jasper's all of that, and additionally verbally a little bit cutting. He's extremely guarded around people because he lost everyone he ever loved. Jasper is the guy who really dives into mentoring newbie Annabelle when she's confused and scared and needs answers. He's good friends with a seriously mentally ill character, X, who other characters are wary of. Jasper isn't just the guy who avoids hurting innocent people. Jasper is convicted that he does not hurt innocent people, and he steps in front of bullets for them, literally. This is a good man with deep convictions and ends up being the moral core of the show early on. And I think that's great. Like, I'm into that. But when I'm really into a piece of fiction, I don't just say it's great. I am transported. I need to take a walk because it lives in me and moves in me, and I need to move. I need to punch something. I need to fuck something. I get really fired up about stories. And am I fired up by a very good man who happens to be a vampire? Yeah, I mean, kinda, sure. So one day, when Jasper's been away for a while on one of his odd jobs, they get word that he's in trouble in his haven. And Jasper's haven is really hard to find, which is great under most circumstances, maybe not so great if you're in trouble and your friends can't find you. But they get a lead and they go underground into the sewers, into access tunnels, which slowly gives way to this maze. This is not an ordinary maze. If you go left, you'll find that you went right. If you go down, you'll find that you went up. If you look behind you, everything has changed. There might even be a wall right behind where you came from. They're attacked by a hungry werewolf in the dark. They find another vampire half decapitated and laid out on a slab. And then finally, When they get to the end of the maze, they find Jasper's Haven. And it's well furnished, but it's full of trapdoors and secret passages. Finally, they hear something moving and they open a secret door. And inside they find a woman in a cage. And she says, please, you have to get me out of here. He's turned me into some kind of vampire. He brings people for me to feed on, and then he feeds on me. He's a monster. I have to get out of here. And this was the point at which I said, hell yes, fuck yes, let's play some fucking vampire. Let's go. This scene and the one afterward, where Jasper explains what the fuck he was doing, are what hooked me. And it's a little more complicated than what the woman was claiming it was, but it wasn't better. One of Jasper's convictions is that he doesn't hurt people, but vampires are not people. So everything that makes Jasper admirable, his personal convictions, everything that makes him sympathetic, the fact that he's lost more than anybody, the fact that he's hurting, are turned into these rock-solid defense mechanisms against anybody who would call him on his bullshit. You have a problem with who he eats? You're vampires, you're monsters. Who are you to pull ethical rank on Jasper? Because Jasper's strengths are also his flaws, he kind of tips precariously between this noble, sympathetic figure and an absolute monster who is a danger to everyone around him, and sometimes within the same scene. And that is a real feat.
I immediately, the knife spins out in my hand. I will put this right between your eyes if you move again.
Like, what a beautifully constructed character for any medium. And what really gets me is he was improvised. Like, the actor called the shot. He set the difficulty way up here and then he nailed it. So like, kudos to Alexander Ward, like really. The plot follows Victor and Nelli as they rise to power, Annabelle as she tries to lead a revolution, and Jasper as he's torn between wanting to be alone and needing to reach out to people. They add 2 new cast members. They have scripted end scenes. They add season epilogues that focus on just one character, often a side character. The level of plot complexity that Jason Carl achieves with this is not something I've seen in other actual play RPG shows. I'm not going to spoil how it ends, but even with how lenient Jason Carl is, it's a vampire game. I can tell you that it ends the way it's supposed to. So, am I going to play vampire again? Well, I'm definitely going to pick up some video games. I'm really looking forward to Bloodlines 2. They've released some text adventure games, and I'm really interested in those. There's a video game called Swan Song that has kind of mixed reviews, but it's by the same developers who released The Council, and I've done a review of that. It's a terrible game, and I love it dearly. I'm not answering the question. So here's the deal. As I get older, I get pickier about the kind of stories I like, I get pickier about the company I keep, and truth be told, I'd really only want to play with people who are really good. On the other side of that, I am incredibly rusty, so I'm no longer good. You see how these two things don't mash, right? But I absolutely do have like stories and characters kicking around in my head, so I want to play. But there's like one more roadblock. I want to be cool. Like, not necessarily to normies, like I'm never going to be cool to normies, and who would want to be, honestly? It's more like, am I really going to put on fishnets and vampire fangs and waddle my ass into a house party? Like, am I going to look cool to all the nerds? Aren't I a little bit old to be playing the knight? And I guess what I really need to do is remember that the knight is older and cooler than I'm ever going to be, and nobody's going to give me permission to have fun. So I just need to get over myself.
sorry now I killed you, for our love was something fine, until they come